Reading the Classical Hollywood Cinema, Film Style, and Mode of Production to 1960 by David Bordwell, Janet Stager, and Kristen Thompson. Part 1, Number 1, in Excessively Obvious Cinema. We all have a notion of the typical Hollywood film. The very label carries a set of expectations, often apparently obvious, about cinematic form and style. We can define that idea, test, and ground those expectations by using the concept of group style. Historians routinely speak of group style in other arts, classicism or the Baroque in music, impressionism or cubism in painting, symbolism or imagism in poetry. Cinema has its own group styles: German expressionism, Soviet montage, and the French New Wave afforded time-honored instances. But to suggest that Hollywood cinema constitutes a group style seems more risky. In other national schools, a handful of filmmakers worked within sharply contained historical circumstances for only a few years, but Hollywood, as an extensive commercial enterprise, included hundreds of filmmakers and thousands of films, and it has existed for over 6 decades. If it is a daunting challenge to define a German expressionist cinema or a neo-realist one, it might seem impossible to circumscribe a distinctive Hollywood quote group style end quote. The historical arguments for the existence of such style are examined later in this book. At this point, a prima facie case for a quote classical Hollywood style end quote depends upon critically examining a body of films. Suppose that between 1917 and 1960, a distinct and homogeneous style has dominated American studio filmmaking, a style whose principles remain quite constant across decades, genres, studios, and personnel. My goal here is to identify at several levels of generality to what extent Hollywood filmmaking adheres to integral and limited stylistic conventions. We could start with a description of the Hollywood style derived from Hollywood's own discourse, that enormous body of statements and assumptions to be found in trade journals, technical manuals, memoirs, and publicity handouts. We would find that the Hollywood cinema sees itself as bound by rules that set stringent limits on individual innovation, that telling a story is the basic formal concern, which makes the film studio resemble the monastery's scriptorium, the site of the transcription and transmission of countless narratives, that unity is a basic attribute of film form, that the Hollywood film purports to be quote realistic end quote in both an Aristotelian sense, truth to the probable, and a naturalistic one, truth to historical fact, that the Hollywood film strives to conceal its artifice through techniques of continuity and quote invisible end quote storytelling, that the film should be comprehensible and unambiguous, and that it possesses a fundamental emotional appeal that transcends class and nation. Reiterated tirelessly for at least 70 years, such precepts suggest that Hollywood practitioners recognize themselves as creating a distinct approach to film form and technique that we can justly label, quote, classical, end quote. We are not used to calling products of American mass culture, quote, classical, end quote, in any sense. The word apparently comes easier to the French speaker. As early as 1965, a French reviewer described Chaplin's Payday 1922 as a representative of, quote, cinematic classicism, end quote, and a year later, Jazmine R spoke of Chaplin, Lubitsch, and Clarence Brown as contributors to a quote classical cinema, end quote, of the future, one, quote, which owes nothing to tricks, where nothing is left to chance, where the smallest detail takes its place of importance in the overall psychological scheme of the film. It was probably Andre Bazin who gave the adjective the most currency. By 1939, Bazin declared Hollywood filmmaking had acquired, quote, all the characteristics of a classical art, end quote. It seems proper to retain the term in English, since the principles which Hollywood claims as its own rely on notions of decorum, proportion, formal harmony, respect for tradition, mimesis, self-effacing craftsmanship, and cool control of the perceiver's response. Canons which critics in any medium usually call, quote, classical. To stress this collective and conserving aspect of Hollywood filmmaking also affords a useful counterweight to the individualist emphases of auteur criticism. Bazin criticized his proteges at Cahiers du Cinéma by reminding them that the American cinema could not be reduced to an assembly of variegated creators, each armed with a personal vision. Block quote, what makes Hollywood so much better than anything else in the world is not only the quality of certain directors, but also the vitality and, in a certain sense, the excellence of a tradition. The American cinema is a classical art, but why not then admire in it what is most admirable, i.e., not only the talent of this or that filmmaker, but the genius of the system, the richness of its ever vigorous tradition, and its fertility when it comes into contact with new elements. End quote. End of block quote. Bazin's point struck the Cahiers writers most forcefully only after his death, partly because the decline of the studio system faced them with mediocre works by such venerated filmmakers as Mann, Ray, and Coker. Quote, we said, end quote, remarked Truffaut bitterly, quote, that the American cinema pleases us and its filmmakers are slaves. What if they were freed? Question mark. And from the moment that they were freed, they made shitty films, end quote. Pierre Cast agreed, quote, better a good cinema du salary than a bad cinema d'auteur, end quote. It is the cinema du salary, at least in its enduring aspects, that represents Hollywood's classicism. All of which is not to say that Hollywood's classicism does not have disparate, even, quote, non-classical, end quote, sources. Certainly, the Hollywood style seeks effects that owe a good deal to, say, romantic music or 19th century melodrama, nor do Hollywood's own assumptions exhaustively account for its practice. The institution's discourse should not set our agenda for analysis. The point is simply that Hollywood films constitute a fairly coherent aesthetic tradition which sustains individual creation. For the purposes of this book, the label, quote, classicism, end quote, serves well because it swiftly conveys distinct aesthetic qualities, elegance, unity, rule-governed craftsmanship, and historical functions. Hollywood's role as the world's mainstream film style. Before there are auteurs, there are constraints. Before there are deviations, there are norms. Norms, paradigms, and standards. In the final analysis, we loved the American cinema because the films all resembled each other. Francois Truffaut. The first and crucial step is to assume that classical filmmaking constitutes an aesthetic system that can characterize salient features of the individual work. The system cannot determine every minute or cannot determine every minute detail of the work, but it isolates preferred practices and sets limits upon invention. The problem is, in other words, that of defining what Jan Mukaovsky has called aesthetic norms. When we think of a norm, especially in a legal sense, we tend to think of a codified and inflexible rule, while Mukaovsky recognized that the aesthetic norms of a period are often felt by artists as constraints upon their freedom. He stressed the norm's comparative flexibility. He argued that the aesthetic norm is characterized by its non-practical nature. The only goal of the aesthetic norm is to permit art works to come into existence. This has important consequences. Disobeying the aesthetic norm is not necessarily a negative act, may indeed be quite productive, and aesthetic norms can change rapidly and considerably. Mukaovsky goes on to inventory several different kinds of norms, all of which intertwine within the art work. There are norms deriving from the materials of the artwork. Poetry, for instance, takes language as its material, but language does not come raw to the task. It brings along norms of everyday usage. Secondly, there are technical norms, basic craft practices such as metrical schemes and genre conventions. Thirdly, there are practical or socio-political norms, e.g., a character's ethical values represented in the work. Finally, Mukaovsky speaks of aesthetic norms as such, which seem to be the basic principles of artistic construction that form the work. These would include concepts of unity, decorum, novelty, and the like. Mukaovsky's work helps us move toward denning the Hollywood cinema as an aesthetic system. Plainly, the Hollywood style has functioned historically as a set of norms. It might seem rash to claim that Hollywood's norms have not drastically changed since around 1920, but Mukaovsky points out that periods of, quote, classicism, end quote, tend toward harmony and stability. Moreover, the idea of multiple norms impinging upon the same work helps us see that it is unlikely that any Hollywood film will perfectly embody all norms. Quote, the interrelations among all these norms, which function as instruments for artistic devices, are too complex, too differentiated, and too unstable for the positive values of the work to be able to appear as virtually identical with the perfect fulfillment of all norms obtaining within it, end quote. No Hollywood film is the classical system. Each is an, quote, unstable equilibrium, end quote, of classical norms. Mukaovsky's work also enable us to anticipate the particular norms which we will encounter. Evidently, classical cinema draws upon practical or ethico-socio-political norms. I shall mention these only when the particular ways of appropriating such norms are characteristic of the classical style. For example, heterosexual romance is one value in American society, but that value takes on an aesthetic function in the classical cinema, as, say, the typical motivation for the principal line of action. Material norms are also present in the cinema when we speak of the, quote, theatrical, end quote, space of the early films, or of the Renaissance representation of the body as important for classical cinema. We are assuming that cinema has absorbed certain material norms from other media. Similarly, I will spend considerable time examining the technical norms of classical filmmaking, since to a large extent these pervasive and persistent conventions of form, technique, and genre constitute the Hollywood tradition. But in order to understand the underlying logic of the classical mode, we must also study how that mode deploys fundamental aesthetic norms. How specifically does Hollywood use such principles as unity and aesthetic function? Question mark. As all these points indicate, the chief virtue of Mukaovsky's work is to enable us to think of a group film style not as a monolith, but as a complex system of specific forces in dynamic interaction. My emphasis on norms should not be taken to imply an ironclad technical formula imposed upon filmmakers. Any group style offers a range of alternatives. Classical filmmaking is not, strictly speaking, formulaic. There is always another way to do something. You can light a scene high or low key. You can pan or track. You can cut rapidly or seldom. A group style thus establishes what semiologists call a paradigm, a set of elements which can, according to rules, substitute for one another. Thinking of the classical style as a paradigm helps us retain a sense of the choices open to filmmakers within that tradition. At the same time, the style remains a unified system because the paradigm offers bounded alternatives. If you are a classical filmmaker, you cannot light a scene in such a way as to obscure the locale entirely. C.F. Godard in La Gaie Sauveur. You cannot pan or track without some narrative or generic motivation. You cannot make every shot 1 second long. CF Avant-Garde Works. Both the alternatives and the limitations of the style remain clear if we think of the paradigm as creating functional equivalence. A cut in may replace a track in, or color may replace lighting as a way to demarcate volumes. Because each device fulfills the same role, basic principles govern not only the elements of the basic principles govern not only the elements in the paradigm, but also the ways in which the elements may function. Our account of this paradigm must also recognize how redundant it is. Not only are individual devices equivalent, but they often appear together. For instance, there are several cues for a flashback in a classical Hollywood film: pensive character attitude, close-up of face, slow dissolve, voiceover narration, sonic quote flashback, end quote music. In any given case, several of these will be used together. In another mode of film practice, such as that of the European quote art cinema end quote of the 1960s, the same general paradigm governs a movement into flashback, but the conventional cues are not so redundant, e.g., pensive close-up with no music or dissolve. The classical paradigm thus often lets the filmmaker choose how to be redundant, but seldom how redundant to be. One more conception of Hollywood cinema as a unified system plays a part in understanding the classical style. This book will also refer to a quote standardized end quote film style. In general, this suggests only adherence to norms, but the term also implies that Hollywood cinema has been made stringently uniform by its dependence upon a specific economic mode of film production and consumption. Calling the Hollywood style quote standardized end quote often implies that norms have become recipes, routinely repeating a stereotyped product. Yet the avant-garde has no monopoly on quality, and violating a norm is not the only way to achieve aesthetic value. I assume that in any art, even those operating within a mass production system, the artwork can achieve value by modifying or skillfully obeying the premises of a dominant style. Levels of generality. If the classical style is a set of norms, we need a way to distinguish greater and lesser degrees of abstraction in that set. A match on action cut is a classical convention. So is the principle of spatial continuity. But the first convention is a particular application of the second. Broadly speaking, we can analyze the classical Hollywood style at 3 levels. 1. Devices. Many isolated technical elements are characteristic of classical Hollywood cinema. Three-point lighting, continuity editing, quote, movie music, end quote, centered framings, dissolves, etc. Such devices are often what we think of as the, quote, Hollywood style, end quote, itself. Yet we cannot stop with simply inventorying these devices. 2. Systems. As members of a paradigm, technical devices achieve significance only when we understand their functions. A dissolve between scenes can convey the passing of time, but so can a cut. To say that the classical Hollywood style ceased to exist when most scenes were linked by cuts is to presume that a style is only the sum of its devices. A style consists not only of recurrent elements, but of a set of functions and relations defined for them. These functions and relations are established by a system. For example, one cinematic system involves the construction of represented space. In classical filmmaking, lighting, sound, image composition, and editing all take as one task the articulation of space according to specific principles. It is this systematic quality that makes it possible for one device to do duty for another, or to repeat information conveyed by another, thus employing a cut to link scenes conforms to one function defined by classical premises. Within this paradigm, there must be some cue for a time lapse between scenes, and a cut may do duty for a dissolve, or a swish pan, or a shot of a clock's moving hands. The systematic quality of film style also sets limits upon the paradigm in representing space. For instance, ambiguous camera positions and discontinuous cutting are unlikely to occur because they violate certain principles of the system. In this book, we shall assume that any functional narrative film possesses three systems: a system of narrative logic, which depends upon story, events, and causal relations and parallelisms among them; a system of cinematic time; and a system of cinematic space. A given device may work within any or all of these systems, depending on the function that the system assigns to the device. 3. Relations of systems. If systems are relations among elements, the total style can be defined as the relation of those systems to each other. Narrative logic, time, and space interact with one another. Does one of them subordinate the others? Do all three operate independently? How are the principles of one justified or challenged by another? In the Hollywood style, the systems do not play equal roles. Space and time are almost invariably made vehicles for narrative causality. Moreover, specific principles govern that process. At this level, even irregularities in the various systems can be seen as purposeful. For instance, if we do find a passage of discontinuous cutting, we can ask whether it is still serving a narrative function, e.g., to convey a sudden shocking event. In such a case, the relation among systems would remain consistent even if the individual device or system varied from normal usage. End of block quote. We can then characterize the classical Hollywood style by its stylistic elements, by its stylistic systems, and most abstractly, by the relations it sets up among these systems. No single level of description will work. It is too narrow to define classical norms by devices, and it is unwarrantably broad to define them solely by relations among systems. The domination of narrative logic over cinematic time and space is common to many styles. Hence the importance of the second level, the stylistic system. The categories of causality, time, and space enable us both to place individual devices within functional context and to see the classical style as a dynamic interplay of several principles. Finally, no categorical explanation of one level can wholly swallow up another. The systematic principle of depicting space ambiguously does not logically entail the use of three-point lighting. Those specific devices are the products of diverse historical processes. Other elements might do as well. The specificity of the classical style depends upon all three levels of generality. My account here will construct the classical stylistic paradigm across several decades, emphasizing the continuity at the second and third levels. But by stressing continuity of function, I do not imply that systems' paradigmatic range did not change somewhat. For example, Before the mid-1920s, the use of high and low angles was severely codified. For long shots, especially of landscapes, for optical point of view, or for reverse shot patterns when one person is higher than other. In reverse shot editing, an image of one element in the scene, typically a person talking, is followed by a shot of another element which is spatially opposite the first, typically a person listening. Chapter 5 furnishes a more systematic explanation. See the examples in figures 16.65 and 16.66 in chapter 16. A medium shot of an object or a human figure would seldom be framed from a sharp high or low angle. Yet in the late 1920s, Hollywood's spatial paradigm widened a bit, probably as a result of the influence of certain German films. Examples can be found in Bulldog Drummond, 1929, and The Show, 1927, which dramatically use high and low angles. See figures 1.1 and 1.2. With the coming of sound, an occasional odd angle could compensate for what was felt to be excessively, quote, theatrical, end quote, scene. See figure 1.3. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, steep angles took their place as common functional equivalents for normal framings in many situations. Across history, the paradigm develops chiefly through changes in the first level of analysis, that of devices. This process will be examined in detail in parts 3, 4, and 6. Viewers, schemata, and mental sets. Considering the classical cinema as a system of norms operating at different levels of generality can seem to create a reified object, a colossal block of attributes that says little about how film viewers see films. The language of objectivism is hard to avoid, especially when we apply spatial metaphors like, quote, levels, end quote. How then are we to characterize the viewer's work, or what E.H. Gumbrich calls, quote, the beholder's share, end quote, question mark. An intricate and comprehensive theory of film viewing has yet to be constructed, and it is not within the scope of this book to do it. Yet, if we want to consider how the Hollywood film solicits a specific way of being understood, we need to recognize at least how passive and, quote, illusionist, end quote, theory makes the spectator. Illusionist theorists usually insist that only avant-garde texts make the viewer perform in, quote, active, end quote, reading, or force the viewer to, quote, work to produce meaning, end quote. The Hollywood spectator, it is claimed, is little more than a receptacle, few skills of attention, memory, discrimination, inference drawing, or hypothesis testing are required. Now, this is clearly too simple. Classical films call forth activities on the part of the spectator. These activities may be highly standardized and comparatively easy to learn, but we cannot assume that they are simple. Consider as one problem the spectator as perceiver. Illusionist theory emphasizes the deceptive quality of projected movement or of shot space. The spectator is duped into taking image for reality. As Noel Birch puts it, quote, spectators experience the diegetic world as environment, end quote. But the recent explorations in aesthetic perception and cognition have shown that, quote, illusion, end quote, is not simply a matter of fooling the eye. The spectator participates in creating the illusion. R.L. Gregory, for instance, speaks of perception as inferential, which makes, quote, illusion, end quote, dependent upon errors of inference, either biological, quote, mechanism, end quote, errors, e.g., the phi phenomenon, as creating the illusion of movement, or cognitive, quote, strategy, end quote, errors, e.g., assuming that the whole is consistent with the displayed parts. Gumbrich has always shown that visual illusion demands that the spectator propose, test, and disregard perceptual hypotheses based on expectation and probability. For illusion to work, the spectator must meet the artwork at least halfway. If perceptual illusion requires some spectatorial activity, even more is required for that imaginative involvement solicited by narrative. No story tells all. Mir Sternberg characterizes following a tale as, quote, gap filling, end quote, and just as we project motion onto a succession of frames, so we form hypotheses, make inferences, erect expectations, and draw conclusions about the film's characters and actions. Again, the spectator must cooperate in filling the film's form. It is clear that the protocols which control this activity derive from the system of norms operating in the classical style. For example, an insistence upon the primacy of narrative causality is a general feature of the classical system. The viewer translates this norm into a tacit strategy for spotting the work's unifying features, distinguishing significant information from, quote, noise, end quote, sorting the film's stimuli into the most comprehensive pattern. Gumbrich describes this process in terms of, quote, schemata, end quote, and, quote, mental sets, end quote. Schemata are traditional formal patterns for rendering subject matter. Gumbrich points out that the artist cannot simply copy reality. The artist can only render the model in terms of one schema or another. Thus, even new shapes will be assimilated to categories which the artist has learned to handle. As Gumbrich puts it, quote, making precedes matching, end quote. The creation of the schema precedes copying the model. After the making, the schema can be modified in each particular case by the artist's purpose, usually the sort of information the artist wants to convey. So far, much of this is congruent with Mukaovsky's argument. We might think of the artist's schemata as technical norms and the artist's purpose as involving specific aesthetic norms. But Gumbrich goes on to show that the schemata and the purpose function for the viewer as well. The artist training is paralleled by the spectator's prior experience of the visual world, and especially of other works. The painter's traditional schemata constitutes the basis of the viewer's expectations or mental set. Quote, a style, like a culture or climate of opinion, sets up a horizon of expectation, a mental set which registers deviations, and modifications with exaggerated sensitivity, end quote. For Gumbrich, this mental set is defined in terms of probabilities. Certain schemata are more likely to fit the data than others. By pairing concepts like schemata and mental set, we can spell out the ways in which the classical film solicits the spectator. For instance, one well-known schema of Hollywood film editing is the shot reverse shot pattern. The filmmaker has this ready to hand for representing any two figures, groups, or objects within the same place. This schema can be fitted to many situations. Whatever the differences of figure placement, camera height, lighting, or focus, whether the image is in the widescreen screen ratio or not, whether the figures are facing one another or not, etc. Because of the tradition behind the schema, the viewer in turn expects to see the shot reverse shot figure, especially in the first shot of the combination appears. If the next shot does not obey the schema, the spectator then applies another, less probable schema to the second shot. The spectator of the classical film thus rifles through the alternatives normalized by the style from most to least likely. Through schemata, the style's norms not only impose their logic upon the material, but also elicit particular activities from the viewer. The result is that in describing the classical system, we are describing a set of operations that the viewer is expected to perform. To stress the task which the film allots to the spectator allows us to abandon certain illusions of our own. We no longer need subscribe to copy theories of cinema, whereby a certain style simply replicates the real world, or normal acts of perception. Schemata tied to historically defined purposes always intervene to guide us in grasping the film. Nor need we imagine a Svengali cinema holding its audience in thrall. The classical schemata have created a mental set that still must be activated by and tested against any given film. Of course, the classical style defines certain spectatorial activities as salient, and the historical dominance of the style has so accustomed us to those activities that audiences may find other schemata more burdensome. Yet, this dynamic concept of the viewer's role allows us to explain the very processes that seem so excessively obvious. As we shall see, even the spectator's rapt absorption results from a hypothesis practices other activities that I'll read it back. As we shall see, even the spectator's rapt absorption results from a hypothesis checking that requires the viewer to meet the film halfway. We can also envision alternative viewing practices, other activities that the spectator might be asked to perform. The chapters that follow then suggest at several points how the norms of the classical Hollywood style encourages specific activities on the part of the spectator. Style in history. If you're not working for Brezhnev Studio Moshfilm, you are working for Nixon Paramount. You forget that this same master has been ordering the same film for 50 years. Wind from the East. To construct the classical Hollywood style as a coherent system, we also need to account for the style's historical dimension. In one sense, this entire book tries to do that by examining the Hollywood mode of production, the consolidation of the style in a specific period, and the changes that the style undergoes in subsequent years. At this point, I must indicate that my overall description of the classical style applies to a set of films across an excessive period. What historical assumptions underlie such a broadly based analysis? The three levels of generality indicate some of those assumptions. My enterprise assumes a historical continuity at the two most abstract levels of style, systems and relations among systems. It assumes that the most distinct changes take place at the level of stylistic devices. For example, through its history, Hollywood cinema seeks to represent events in a temporally continuous fashion. Moreover, narrative logic has generally worked to motivate this temporal continuity. What changes through history are the various devices for representing temporal continuity, such as intertitles, cuts, irises, dissolves, wipe pans, and wipes. By stressing the enduring principles of the classical style, we lose some specific detail. In this part, I shall not reconstruct the choices available to filmmakers at any given moment. If I say that a scene can begin by drawing back from a significant figure or object, that suggests that an iris, a cut, and a camera movement are all paradigmatic alternatives. But in 1917, the most probable choice would have been the iris. In 1925, the cut. In 1935, the camera movement. In discussing the general principles of classical style, I shall often project the historically variable devices onto the same plane to show their functional equivalence. This bird's eye view enables us to map the basic and persistent features of the style in history. The more minute history of the devices themselves forms the bulk of parts 3, 4, and 6. Historical analysis demands a concept of periodization. Since we are concerned here with a stylistic history, we cannot presuppose that the periods used to write political or social history will demarcate the history of an art. That is, there is no immediate compulsion to define a, quote, cinema of the 1930s, end quote, as drastically different from that of quote, the 40s, end quote, or to distinguish pre-World War II Hollywood style from post-war Hollywood style. What, then, will constitute our grounds for periodization? Norms, yes, but also the film industry, the most proximate and pertinent institution for creating, regulating, and maintaining those norms. This is not to say that film style and mode of production march across decades in perfect synchronization. Parts 2 and 5 will provide a periodization for the Hollywood mode of production that while congruent in some respects cannot be simply superimposed upon stylistic history. Nevertheless, we have chosen to frame our study within the years 1917 through 1960. The earlier date is easier to justify. Stylistically, from 1917 on, the classical model became dominant in the same sense that most American fiction films since that moment employ fundamentally similar narrative, temporal, and spatial systems. At the same time, the studio mode of production had become organized, detailed division of labor, the continuity script, and a hierarchical managerial system became the principal filmmaking procedures. Parts 2 and 3 detail how style and industry came to be so closely synchronized by 1917, but why halt an analysis of the classical Hollywood cinema in 1960? The date triggers suspicion. Stylistically, there is no question that, quote, classical, end quote, films are still being made, as Part 7 will show. Variants of the Hollywood mode of production continue as well. There are thus compelling reasons to claim that 1960 is a premature cutoff point. On the other hand, some critics may assert that this, quote, classical, end quote, period is far too roomy. One can see any period after 1929 as the, quote, breakdown, end quote, of the Hollywood cinema, the tensions of the Depression, the anguish of the war and Cold War, and the competitive challenge of television. The year 1960 was chosen for reasons of history and of convenience. In the film industry, it was widely believed that at the end of the decade, Hollywood had reached the end of its mature existence. This was Hollywood, the title of a 1960 book by publicist Beth Day, summarizes many reasons for considering the year as a turning point. Most production firms had converted their energies to television, the dominant mass entertainment form since the mid 1950s. Many had reduced their holdings in studio real estate. Stars had become free agents. Most producers had become independent. The B film was virtually dead. To Day's account, we can add other signs of change. By 1960, a certain technological state of the art had been reached. High definition color films, wide formats, and high fidelity magnetic sound had set the standard of quality that continues today. Moreover, other styles had began to challenge the dominance of classicism. The international art cinema, spearheaded by Ingmar Bergman, Akira Kurosawa, certain Italian directors, and the French New Wave, offered a more influential and widely disseminated alternative to Hollywood than had ever existed before. Not that Hollywood was significantly shaken. Part 7 tries to show why, but the force of the classical norm was reduced somewhat. Despite these reasons, it remains somewhat arbitrary to see 1960 as closing the classical period. We have chosen it partly because it makes our research somewhat manageable while still conveying the powerful spread of the classical cinema's authority. The ordinary film. Film historians have not generally acknowledged the place of the typical work. In most film histories, masterworks and innovations rise monumentally out of a hazy terrain whose contours remain unknown. In other arts, however, the ordinary work is granted considerable importance. Academicism, mainstream works, the canon, tradition, the history of music, painting, and literature could not do without such conceptions. Quote, I believe, end quote, remarks Roman Jacobson, quote, that a very important thing in analyzing trends in the cinema or the structure of a film is the necessity of considering the base, the background of the spectator's habits. What films is the spectator used to seeing? Question mark. To what forms is he accustomed? Question mark. End quote. My analysis of the norms of the classical style thus gives privileged place not to the aberrant film that breaks or tests the rules, but to the quietly conformist films that try simply to follow them. Between 1915 and 1960, at least 15,000 feature films were produced in America. It is impossible to analyze such a corpus. To construct a model of the ordinary film, we have selected in an unbiased fashion 100 films from this period. Appendix A explains the sampling procedure and lists the films. We studied each film with a horizontal viewing machine, recording stylistic details of each shot and summarizing the film's action scene by scene. This body of data constitutes our unbiased sample, abbreviated UNS, and when we cite such a film, an asterisk signals it. In the stylistic analysis of the cinema, the practice of unbiased sampling is unprecedented, but we believe it to be a sound way to determine historical norms. When the sample turned up what might be regarded as auteur films, we accepted this as inevitable in an unbiased sample and treated these films exactly as we did others. At least 4/5 of the sample, however, constitute a body of fairly obscure productions ranging across decades, studios, and genres. Furthermore, we have sought to test the conclusions about the UNS films by closely analyzing almost 200 other Hollywood films of the 1915 through 1960 period. We chose many of these films for their quality or historical influence, but many were as undistinguished as our UNS items. We shall refer to this second set of films as the extended sample, ES. My analysis of the classical style takes the UNS films as the central source of evidence and examples, drawing upon ES films occasionally. This means that many of the films mentioned will be unfamiliar to readers, but since I argue for their typicality, the reader will recognize qualities present in many other films. In one sense, the concept of group style simply makes manifest what we and Hollywood itself, quote, already know, end quote. Concepts like norm, paradigm, stylistic alternatives, levels of systemic function, periodization, and schemata are, from this perspective, simply tools in making our habitual intuitions explicit. But these concepts also enable us to reveal the patterned and stable quality of our assumptions. The concepts can show that the classical cinema has an underlying logic which is not apparent from our common sense reflection upon the films or from Hollywood's own discourse about them. The theoretical concepts introduced in this chapter are indispensable to grasping the classical style's systematic quality. Armed with them, we can go on to examine how the style characteristically organizes causality, time, and space. The next 5 chapters, then, should trigger a certain déjà vu. The reader will recognize some familiar filmmaking practices, but these chapters also seek to explain in a systematic way how these practices work together to create a distinct film style which, like Poe's purloined letter, quote, escapes observation by dint of being excessively obvious, end quote. And I was reading chapter 1 in Excessively Obvious Cinema in the Classical Hollywood Cinema, Film Style and Mode of Production to 1960 by David Bordwell, Janet Stager, and Kristen Thompson.